Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And having made multiple videos about Marvel's Ultimate Universe, I like to think I'm well versed in both the history and the concept of this imprint. But even if you just started following Marvel's recently relaunched Ultimate Universe, it's worth remembering just how impactful that concept was. Because if you're under a certain age, you might not remember just how much the Ultimate Universe changed the comic book industry in the early 2000s. It wasn't just new, bold, and different. It was exactly what the industry needed at that time. And sure, some of those titles haven't aged particularly well, but it did set a precedent. And now, it seems like DC Comics is looking to follow that precedent themselves. According to news and rumor sites like Bleeding Cool, DC is preparing to launch their very own Ultimate-style DC universe. Unofficially, this imprint will be called Absolute Comics, and it will be overseen by Scott Snyder, one of DC's most accomplished creators. Now, beyond those details, we don't know much else. We don't know the format, the style, or the overall vision of this new DC universe. But we do know that this won't be another line-wide reboot in the mold of the New 52 that DC attempted in 2011. The current DC continuity will continue to run, just as the mainline Marvel universe ran when the first Ultimate Universe launched. Even with such scarce details, I'm already very interested in this move. I know I talk mostly about Marvel on my channel, but I've always kept an eye on DC. And over the years, I followed plenty of DC comics, including books from the mainline continuity and their many Elseworlds like Injustice and Earth-1. However, in recent years, I've found myself following DC comics less and less. Aside from Superman and Wonder Woman's respective solo books, which I've been following for years now, there just hasn't been much to interest me. Sure, I'll occasionally pick up a few collections like Tom Taylor's Nightwing or the Big Three Jokers event, but the larger DC continuity just doesn't feel as accessible as it once was. And in many respects, that's exactly where Marvel was in the early 2000s before they launched the first Ultimate Universe. It's also where DC was prior to launching their big New 52 reboot. And since the New 52 was ultimately undone for reasons that are too numerous to fit into one video, it seems like DC is attempting a more hybrid approach. Personally, I think that's the right move. Given what's been going on behind the scenes with their movies, as well as a notable lack of major animated shows, the time feels right for something like Absolute Comics, and if it succeeds, it can only help the comic book industry as a whole. But as intrigued as I am by the concept, I also have concerns. And I'd like to explore both while also speculating on what the best and worst case scenarios might be for Absolute Comics. Now, before I get into that, I want to disclose something that I'm sure will put me at odds with many other DC Comics fans. And it's this. I actually liked the New 52 reboot for the most part. And I know, that's a minority opinion. I freely acknowledge that might color my perspective on this new imprint as well as the mainline DC continuity as it currently stands. But if we're going to assess the potential of Absolute Comics, I think it's worth revisiting the New 52. Because a big reason why DC Comics is where it is today has its origin in what happened with the New 52. There certainly is a long, messy history surrounding this powerful moment in DC history. I'm certainly not qualified to recount that history or everything that led up to it. For a more comprehensive overview of that story, I recommend checking out a video from the channel Owen Likes Comics. I'll leave a link in the description. But the long and short of it is this. DC sought to revitalize its entire comics line, so it used the events of Flashpoint to essentially reboot the entire timeline. That meant every series, every franchise, and every character could get a fresh start. They wouldn't be starting completely from scratch. Most of DC's iconic characters were largely the same, but their histories were now different. Wonder Woman was now the daughter of Zeus. Superman's adopted parents died in a car crash when he was still a young adult. And on top of that, he was no longer married to Lois Lane. Barbara Gordon was also Batgirl again, now able to walk thanks to a neural implant. Alan Scott never became Green Lantern, and the Justice Society of America never even formed. Other changes were relatively minor, but the effort was still bold, as well as controversial. More than a few fans expressed their dismay about so many years of continuity being effectively undone. There was also plenty of backlash to how certain characters behaved very differently. And for a prime example, just look at what happened to Starfire during the early days of the New 52. All these controversies aside, you could still make the case that the New 52 was successful in the beginning. Many of those newly renumbered series sold well, as any comic with a fancy number 1 on the cover tends to do. It also drew a lot of interest from fans in major comic media outlets. For me personally, the New 52 was one of those rare times when I probably read more DC comics than Marvel comics. And sure, most of that was out of pure curiosity. I did end up dropping a fair amount of series after a couple of months. But I still regularly followed around a half dozen books for a while. Some even had moments that I really liked. But eventually, this initiative lost whatever momentum it might have had when it began. It didn't happen suddenly, but it wasn't gradual either. After about 3 years or so, it was easy to see that the entire comic book line had lost a sense of vision and coherence. At times, multiple visions seemed to clash with one another. Reading a Justice League comic, a Batman comic, and a Green Lantern comic felt like entirely different universes. The connections these books had when the reboot began just disappeared or faded. And as writing and editorial teams changed, the overarching tone of the line broke down even more. It got to a point where nobody at DC seemed to know what to build on this foundation. And on top of all that, the New 52 still alienated many fans of the old continuity. And the fans they might have gained from the reboot just weren't enough to keep it going. Ultimately, the New 52 was undone by the Rebirth Initiative. This retconned most of the changes, effectively re-establishing the post-crisis continuity. Once again, Superman and Lois Lane were married. Alan Scott and the Justice Society were canon. And Wonder Woman was no longer the daughter of Zeus. There's certainly a lot more I could say about the New 52 era, but with respect to this new initiative, I'll just highlight the major lessons learned and how Absolute Comics can set itself up for the long term. Now, the New 52 was certainly bold and ambitious, but it also had way too many moving parts creatively. It was difficult to follow and became inconsistent every time new creative teams came aboard. Absolute Comics can avoid that by simply having a more overarching vision. I think having Scott Snyder at the helm certainly helps in that regard. Beyond being one of DC's most accomplished writers, he knows how to establish a vision, see it through, and foster plenty of world building along the way. His role could be akin to that of Kevin Feige at Marvel Studios in that he creates the sandbox, and he chooses who gets to play in it, provided their visions align with his. In addition, it's also important that the overall number of titles for Absolute Comics remains limited and easy to follow. That's exactly what the early Ultimate Universe did for Marvel. They created an imprint where a casual fan need only follow 4 or 5 comics a month, and that was all they needed to keep up with a sprawling Marvel universe. Along the way, there was also plenty of room for miniseries, special issues, and crossovers. But they all aligned with one another in a way that felt cohesive. And a good rule of thumb for DC might be that if you need more than 2 hands to keep track of this universe on a monthly basis, then chances are it has too many books. The overall goal of Absolute Comics shouldn't be to supplant the main DC continuity. It just needs to offer an alternative to those who don't want to learn the difference between pre-crisis and post-crisis Superman. And that alternative needs to be simple, streamlined, and easy to follow. Beyond the organization of Absolute Comics, there's also the matter of just how different this new universe will be from other DC imprints. And it's here where my concerns tend to overshadow my hopes. There will certainly be a temptation to radically reimagine every DC character, from their looks to their uniforms to their backstories to their love interests. That's all well and good. Absolute Comics should take advantage of the extra creative freedom it offers. However, there's a fine line between being too similar to other DC comics and being too different. If Superman is so different that he just doesn't feel like Superman anymore, then Absolute Comics just isn't going to work in the long run. The same goes for Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, The Flash, and every other iconic DC character. What makes them different from their mainline counterparts can't be too great, otherwise they're just different characters who happen to go by a familiar name. How they get to being the heroes we know and love, that's where there's much more creative freedom. For example, the path to becoming Batman has a few immutable details, but the overall journey is ripe for new ideas and visions. Think about what would happen if Bruce Wayne lost his parents in the same tragic way, but during the 21st century. And what if Wonder Woman started exploring man's world in a different era? How they get to donning their iconic costumes can take many forms, and where they go afterwards can be just as broad. This is where Absolute Comics can really set itself apart in a meaningful way. But even if the distinctions are managed well, there's also the overall tone. Marvel's first Ultimate Universe was dark, edgy, and overly crude at times. While it certainly worked for a while, the gimmick eventually wore off. It also doesn't help that DC Comics already dealt with a tone problem with its movies. Zack Snyder's vision for the DCEU certainly had its moments, but there's no question that the tone was very dark, literally and figuratively. That might have made for some good aesthetics here and there, but in the long run, it just didn't work. Absolute Comics needs to have the right tone and ambience, more so than the movies or Marvel's former Ultimate Universe. Whatever form that should take, I won't claim to know, but I don't doubt it'll require a hell of a balancing act. It needs to be different, but not too different. It also needs to offer something that resonates with audience at a unique time for the superhero genre. As this initiative is set to launch, DC and Warner Brothers are set to completely relaunch their cinematic universe. The comics industry as a whole also happens to be entering a whole new era with unique social and political overtones. And there's definitely a place for Absolute Comics to establish itself within these circumstances. That I strongly believe. And I'll definitely be cheering it on. It could perfectly complement DC's renewed efforts with its movies. It could also offer something new within a market that Marvel has dominated for over 2 decades on multiple fronts. Whether or not it actually succeeds, it's way too early to say. But DC Comics has always been at its best when it champions unchanging, heroic ideals in a constantly changing world. They offer something aspirational when everyone else is slipping into cynicism. They offer a hope for a better tomorrow when it's all too easy to succumb to despair. DC's characters embody the best of what we seek in our heroes, and if Absolute Comics can capture that in a bold new way, then I absolutely believe that it will succeed. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.